Hello! Today I'm delving into the character of Noctis, who is the main protagonist of Final Fantasy XV, and the centre of the Shakespearean-esque tragedy of events that unfolds therein. Now, Final Fantasy XV is interesting because, at a glance, and in popular surface-level reviews and opinions, it centres around this happy-go-lucky bromance, wherein four friends traverse the world together in boy band attire, telling jokes and eating. But actually, this idea of Final Fantasy XV is taking it only at face value, and what the happy-go-lucky angle does brilliantly is actually juxtapose and augment some quite severe and tragic themes that transpire later in the game, and particularly hinging around the story of our main hero, Noctis. So, turning to Noctis, we see someone who is an irrefutably fated individual, and preordained to take up his father's mantle. He is aware from an early age, and particularly by the time Final Fantasy XV rolls around, that he has a weight of responsibility to inherit, the first being the ancestral guardianship of Lucis and its crystal, and the second being the alliance forged with his arranged marriage to Lunafreya, in an effort to cool geopolitical tensions. And these factors are interesting facets of story that inform Noctis' attitudes and his characteristics throughout the game, particularly early on. Being a crown prince naturally precludes him from much of the freedom and fun a normal teenager might be permitted to have. And even in instances when he does get to adventure, the burden that awaits his future and his status as a prince is an ever-present factor, and is indeed the reason that he has his loyal retainers, Gladio, Prompto, and Ignis, around him at all times. So, this burden clearly takes its toll on Noctis early on, and we find him slightly brooding and sarcastic at times. Most tellingly, in his last conversation with his father, King Regis, we see him being mildly dismissive of his quest ahead, even as Regis is telling him that wherever he goes, the line of Lucis goes with him. And, on the note of this brooding demeanour, many long-time fans of Final Fantasy have noted comparisons between Noctis and also Squall from Final Fantasy VIII, and it's true enough that both are inclined to brood and internalise their burdens. Both are accompanied by a party of friends they've known for a long time that attempt to console them, and other such parallels, like this. However, if we look at the philosophical backdrop of each character's plight, we can see a polarising emotional trigger that sets each of them off. Squall and Noctis are actually quite different individuals in terms of their emotional crisis. Turning first to Squall, it's evident throughout much of Final Fantasy VIII that this guy suffers from periodic existential crisis due to his constant indecision and indecisiveness, particularly once he has leadership unfairly thrust upon him. The essence of existentialism is that we have to deal with the horror of being completely free and having the responsibility to choose our own path. And as Jean-Paul Sartre famously wrote, man is condemned to be free, which is to say, crisis and angst comes at realising we are masters of our own destinies. And Squall's fear about choosing the wrong path and making the wrong decision is the backbone of his personality, exacerbated by the early loss of Elone, or Big Sis as he calls her, which ushered him prematurely into this reality in which we are all alone and all free to do as we will. Now, Noctis, on the other hand, has angst and crisis for quite the opposite reason. Through predetermined fate, he was born and raised to inherit the burdens of his forefathers, and the basis of the concept of fatalism is the idea that there is a fixed natural order to things, which, in terms of Final Fantasy XV, sees a world in which a Lucian king is always required to inherit the throne and protect the crystal and keep the darkness, the Starscourge, at bay. So, compared to Squall, the fact that Noctis' life goals are so narrowed down to this predetermined journey, this is the essence of his angst and his crisis, particularly early on, and up until the moment that he matures and finally accepts his fate, and is stepping into the shoes of his father. Now, moving on, I've referenced Shakespeare before with regards to Final Fantasy, particularly when discussing Final Fantasy IX and the theatrical set pieces employed there. And regarding Final Fantasy XV, I really see glimpses of Shakespeare's Hamlet in the plot trajectory of Noctis and some of the key episodes and turning points that take place here. Firstly, for those unfamiliar, Hamlet is a revenge tragedy about the eponymous Danish prince who is ousted from his birthright after his uncle Claudius murders his father and takes his place as king. Much like in Final Fantasy XV, we have Ardyn, who, while not swinging the sword, or should I say applying the poison himself, he is certainly the architect of Regis's murder, and so it kind of imitates this image of an older relative, usurping the rightful king, in this case Noctis instead of Hamlet, as the king of Lucis instead of Denmark. In Hamlet, we also have Hamlet's trusted retinue of friends, Horatio, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and although the latter two in this play are kind of useless, there is a fair amount of joking and clowning between these friends in both stories, and Horatio in particular really reminds me and runs parallels with the character of Ignis as an informed confidant, for Prince Hamlet, and, just as Ignis is for Prince Noctis. And finally, we have the infamous Ophelia, Hamlet's tragic romance who drowns in a suspected suicide. And I think Ophelia and Lunafreya can be considered analogues to one another, as both seem predestined to tragedy alongside their princes, and they also communicate excessively with said princes by letter up until their demise. Luna's death, on that note, while not by drowning, also occurs in water, so runs an interesting parallel with the aforementioned Ophelia's death as well. So, looking at Noctis and considering his friends, his romance, and his greatest foe, who happens to be a relative, there are strong correlations to the Shakespeare play here, and many of my friends have mentioned that it also reminds them of The Lion King, actually. But it's worth noting that The Lion King, the Disney film, is also based on Hamlet, so all of these roads lead back to Shakespeare, in my opinion. But one thing unique to The Lion King that I will say is similar in Final Fantasy XV is how Simba returns and goes back to Pride Rock as a grizzled adult, with his mane that's come through and stuff like that. And it kind of reminds me of how Noctis returns 10 years later and he's kind of got his beard coming in and things like that. So that's quite an interesting parallel to make specifically to the Disney film. So, moving on from Noctis' story arc within a Shakespearean framework, let's look at the thematic and etymological qualities of his character and how they fit in, to the game story and the wider game narrative. Now, some of you may know, if you've listened to my Final Fantasy VIII character analysis specifically, I'm a massive fan of symbolism, and I think Final Fantasy in general, does rely on symbolism and allegory quite a lot, and one of the reasons I like it so much. And Final Fantasy XV really relies on metaphor with its naming conventions, probably to the largest extent we've seen since Final Fantasy VIII, where we had the water illusions between Squall, Laguna and Rain, to indicate this family connection. So Final Fantasy XV hinges thematically and literally, in terms of narrative, on the concept of light and dark. As such, there's a lot of connotations around light and dark in its naming conventions too. So we have Lucis coming from the Latin root word lux, which means light, and Noctis coming from the Latin root word nox, which means night. And we also have Caelum, which can be interpreted as sky or heaven in Latin too. So the Lucian light aspect kind of speaks for itself really, because the purpose of this line of kings is to preserve the light and the crystal against the darkness. In their city Insomnia, which of course insomnia is a word for sleeplessness, which further indicates the perpetual vigilance in this task by the Lucian kings perhaps. The word Caelum, meaning heaven, is also significant and almost certainly relates to Noctis' status as a king, because much like royalty in the real world, Lucians become kings by what's known politically as the divine right of kings. And basically what this means, particularly in the United Kingdom, but I think it's the same for royalty everywhere, it basically means that you're ordained by God. But in the case of Final Fantasy, you're ordained by the crystal and the favour of the astrals for your bloodlines to inherit the kingship and the powers therein. So there's a lot of allegory with Noctis being referred to as the one true king and the king of kings, because this is also how Jesus is referred to in the Bible, during his pilgrimage and his eventual self-sacrifice. So there's a very fated divine angle to the Noctis adventure in terms of this questing pilgrimage he has towards an almost certain selfless death. And on that note, this is also quite similar in part to Yuna's pilgrimage in Final Fantasy X, which I think takes on a very similar Christ-like symbolism in terms of its pilgrimage and sacrifice at the end. So, positioning Noctis in this Christian fashion leads comfortably into considering and discussing Ardyn, who, among other things, can be posited as the Antichrist to Noctis's Christ-like image. And I'll be covering this in a later episode when I get around to discussing Ardyn in depth, but suffice it to say, he's a really good antagonist and has a wealth of equal interpretation and symbolic meaning that can be held up alongside his character, as we're doing currently with Noctis. So, the crux of Noctis' story arc is an atypical coming-of-age tale. He's always been aware of his birthright and the expectations upon him, but following his father's murder, we see him prematurely thrust into the world and, prematurely inheriting this responsibility. It makes his earlier farewell with his father, which I discussed earlier, all the more poignant, as he handled it in quite a nonchalant, informal way, of course expecting to see his father again quite soon. So there is this pang of lost opportunity here that I think subtly haunts the character of Noctis as he progresses through his adventure. There's also his relationship with Lunafreya, which, through the game events, we find tragically cut short and unfulfilled, lending further credibility to this game being a Shakespearean tragedy. Now, Luna and Noctis don't really interact with one another through the events of Final Fantasy XV, and their relationship being confined to flashbacks has been argued as a detriment to the emotional impact of her demise. And it's true enough that Noctis, at least at face value, is slightly less impacted by the news of her death than with his father's. However, I think one of the key thematic qualities of Final Fantasy XV is the sense of duty and sacrifice that's bounded up with the responsibility of royalty. As I mentioned earlier, free will is given up for higher causes, such as political alliances, political marriages, and the responsibilities of being the Oracle and the Lucian King, with regards to this game specifically. So, to compare with Final Fantasy VIII again, we see Squall develop a very organic and potent love for Rinoa over the course of the game. From an initial dislike, his emotions grow in a naturally romantic way. Noctis and Luna, on the other hand, have this predetermined path I mentioned earlier, and from the childhood flashbacks we see them discussing their respective duties, which later manifests into a marriage proposal and a marriage alliance. So, ultimately, the tragedy of Luna and Noctis is interesting, and whether you choose to believe their love is fostered through a genuine romance, or whether it's fostered through this sense of unified duty towards their subjects, I think it's safely and purposefully ambiguous, enough for players to interpret, and also influence in-game, depending on the responses you choose to send in the notebook, which is sent between them. On this note, and regarding the ambiguity around Final Fantasy XV, I think if you type into Google, does Noctis, generally the first autofill responses are, does Noctis die? And the second is, does Noctis love Luna? Which owes to the ambiguity in the storytelling here, again, whether it's intentional or not. So, wrapping up on Noctis now, and referring finally to death, sacrifice and duty, these are the themes that I think the game hinges quite heavily around regarding him. And firstly, I think it's great how they showed him age 10 years. I keep harping on about how Final Fantasy XV is tragic, but it really does show a certain fallibility to the characters that we don't have in any of the other Final Fantasy games. We have Ignis going blind, we have Ravus becoming undead, we have Ardyn taking over the world, in the future. So it's a permeably dark game that only sees the good guys win by sacrificing two of our main heroes. And on this note, I think the closing moments that sees floral tributes to Noctis and Luna, and their spirits occupying the thrones, finally at rest, is a beautiful and haunting closure for the events of the game that we've spent so many hours venturing through.